How's everyone doing here? Are you all awake? Oh, okay, that was pretty good. It's good. Everyone's awake. Yeah, so as you've just heard, I'm Rachel. That's me. And as you said, I've worked on products at Google for a long time now. And in particular, an area of interest for me is to work on products that focus on sort of emerging markets, next billion users, whatever terminology every company is using these days. So I spent some time on Chrome building features for these users. I'll talk more about them. And I've actually just moved to a new product. It's called Google Go, and I'll tell you about that as well. And so I want to talk today a little bit about the needs of these users and why building for them can make us all better at our jobs, whatever product we're working on. But first, what places are we actually talking about when we use phrases like emerging markets or next billion users? So that's the world. And there are actually more people alive inside this circle today than there are outside of it. How many people here feel deeply connected to people or places inside this circle? Yes. So few. So I'm going to touch on some important stats for all of us working in design or technology today. So first of all, in 2016, India surpassed the United States and became the second largest internet market in the world. It's actually just behind China. As of 2017, that's the latest very solid number. They have about 355 million users, people online, and that's larger than the whole population of the US, which previously was the biggest market for many companies. And we're looking at, by 2020, the prediction from GSMA is that they'll have more than 1 billion users online in India. We're coming up on that quickly. So if we know that our next billion users, our next billion internet users will be coming from markets like India, from emerging markets is what many companies call them, I think it's important to say that it's increasingly likely that many of us will find them among the users of our own products today. So these are some of the countries that are focal points for me and my work. So we think about the number of users and expected growth when we try to define the markets that we're going to be focusing on. India is the second largest market, and that's been my focus over the last few years. Obviously, other countries like Indonesia and other parts of Southeast Asia, Brazil, and Nigeria. China, obviously, I won't speak to today. And ultimately, though, developed in emerging markets, it's not really the right terminology. And I use them because there hasn't really been a good alternative in the past. But I want to talk a little bit about a book called Factfulness. If you haven't read it, it's a wonderful read. It's really easy to digest, but it presents a new perspective on our worldview, I think. It's by Hans Rosling, and he proposes a new way of looking at things. So he breaks the world's population down into four groups, and in particular by income level. So level 1, living on less than $2 a day, and up to level 4, living on more than $32. That's most of us. And his organization did some work. They collected photographs of people's lives from many different countries across all of the different income levels. And they started to bring them together into these groups. And what they saw was that there was an enormous amount of overlap between what their lives looked like. You can actually go online. It's called oh shit, I've lost the name. If you look up Hans Rosling, you'll find his organization. You can look at all the photos and you can see what people's lives look like in a lot of detail, from things like how they get to work to where they get water or how they even brush their teeth at night. So I think one of the most important characteristics for us, we focus on levels 2 and 3. And what we're seeing is that these are groups of people who are starting to come online. They're starting to be able to buy mobile phones, and they value them, and they choose to purchase them. And so I think one of the most important characteristics that's exciting for anyone working in this market in this industry is that many new users are coming online mobile first and mobile only. I know we talked 5 years ago about mobile first and the idea that everyone's got a mobile phone and we should design for mobile first. But this is something completely different. This is the idea that my primary device, the only device I might have, is a mobile device. So, and this is not just happening in countries like India and Nigeria. About a quarter of adults in the UK use only a device other than a computer to go online. And in the US, only about 1 in 5 households are using only cell data to go online. So mobile-first users are everywhere, and they're truly mobile-first or mobile-only. And their needs at the moment are not really being met. So we learned this. This is what Chrome looked like in I think 2009, I want to say. So products like Chrome were originally designed based on the desktop browser. It's sort of around the time that Chrome was becoming really successful was when they started to say, oh, maybe we need a mobile browser. We better think about that. And so they took the features that had been really popular on desktop and they ported them over to mobile, because that's what users had come to expect and loved. And so then fast forward to 2014, and I was working at the team at the time, and what we started to find was that there were these new mobile-only users who were coming online, and there were fundamental aspects of the product that just didn't work for them. So I worked on a variety of features at Chrome. I'll point out a few of them today. And I felt that we were able to make a good impact for these users. We built things around previewing and making websites load more quickly. We built features around downloading to kind of allow people to bring websites onto their device in case their connection dropped out. We built things around translation. And I think we were able to make a big, substantial impact for those users and also reverse the trend in sort of drop off of Chrome usage. Now I think I'm more interested in pushing the envelope a bit further to try to think about what radical things we could do to make the internet, a source of great information accessible to people who might be lower literacy or might have very limited resources. So that's some of the projects I'm thinking about today. I'll touch on them very briefly since we have limited time. Okay. So this is Google Go. I like to introduce it because most people I speak to probably haven't seen it. We actually only launched globally a few months ago, but we've been available in countries like India and Nigeria for a long time. This app is actually default loaded onto Android Go devices, which you probably also haven't seen. They're sort of the low-end devices that we launch in certain markets that many people purchase as their first device. I think the thing to know about Google Go is that it's not just a search app, which is maybe a little controversial at a search company, but it's an internet app. And the idea is about finding ways to make the web useful and even lovable for people in this next billion users group. And it's an interesting product because the story of Google Go, sort of in the context of a big company, it's about a small team in London that moved from their initial concept through to a launched product in about 15 months with a user research-led approach. I think broadly, Google has a very high level of user research across the company. I think we have good resources for this. But Google Go's approach is radically different, and it really is about driving product development. Let's see, is there anything else to note about here? Yeah, anyway, their research process and the kind of measurable improvements they made for their users, that's the reason I joined the team. So I want to tell you just a little bit about how the team works and maybe how you can adopt some of their practices in your own work. Okay, so this is a slide that describes our slightly frenetic research cadence. The research cadence is very rigorous and it's continuous. It happens on a weekly basis with lab studies. So we do 1 week in Nigeria, 1 week in India, and so on and so forth. We have research assistants based in the ground there, and they coordinate with our research team lead in the London office. And we also work with, this is interesting to some folks, we work with React-based prototypes that are built with a custom toolkit. And that allows us to have sort of high-fidelity interactive mocks that we can send across to our researchers in different countries. We can fairly easily translate things into other languages. Knock on wood, we have a study in Marathi next week that we haven't finished translation for, but we'll get there. And we also run diary studies. So we run diary studies on a monthly basis. And again, sort of in the countries I've described. We work with prototypes built with the engineering team. And this is something that's quite radical. I think part of the immersion studies I'll talk about in a moment, it's about bringing the whole team to the countries where we work, just as you've already heard earlier today. And that means that the engineering team is often more bought in. And so they're willing to spend time on building prototypes when they could be building shippable code. And that's one of the most radical differences that I've seen with this team, is when I say to an engineer, hey, we need a prototype build. Can you get on that really right away? They say, oh yeah, great. I'll get that started. I'll put down the thing that I'm building to ship, and let's get this done, because that'll get us closer to the end of the pipeline. And then the immersion studies, I'll talk about that in more detail. I think they're something that they're quite a heavy investment for the team. We bring a team of maybe 10 people across all of the different disciplines to another country for 10 days. And that's quite a heavy investment. But what we've seen is that it changes the culture of the team. Everyone has a deeper understanding, not just of the demographics of the people that we're trying to build something for, but what their lives actually might look like, and what kind of needs are actually relevant to them. So we end up having fewer conversations about building products that are in the interests of the company, and really building products that are going to serve these users. And that's how we know we're going to be more successful. Okay, so I'm going to tell you briefly about an immersion we took a few months ago that was in Kanpur in India. We went with a cross-functional team. We had engineering, PM, UX, obviously, and our research leads. And then we had our research assistant who joined from Bangalore, as well as some additional facilitators. And obviously some translators as well, since most of us don't speak Hindi. So we ran the diary study in advance. So for the 2 weeks before our immersion, we had UXR builds in the hands of our users. They were using them daily to try to so we could try to understand what the experience looked like over a period of time. And then when we arrived on the ground, we had in-home interview sessions. So me and a team of 3 or 4 people bundle into a car, drive to someone's home, and get out and meet them and talk with them for about an hour about all kinds of things about their lives and their needs, and whether the app was fulfilling their needs or not. And then we would do some cafe sessions as well. So this is not really the standard cafe study. We don't just pop over to Starbucks and meet some people. We would set up sessions with some specific groups of people, and we would meet in the cafe. And the reason for this is that it would be a bit more of a casual setting. It can be a little bit shorter and a little bit quicker, but also because the user groups that we're targeting, we really want to be specific. We're looking at maybe lower literacy users, we're looking at more vulnerable groups sometimes, and we want to make sure that we're able to meet them in a convenient place, maybe near their home, and make sure that we get the right gender balance, for example. So trying to really sort of hit the mark on all of our research needs. Okay, so one important note with all of this is we do per session debriefs. I'm looking for researchers who know what I mean, but I see nods. It means that when you're driving between sessions in the car, that we're sitting there making furious notes and trying to create a summary of each session directly afterwards. And this is really important because, partially because it's such a deep investment to do these kinds of trips, that you really want to gather all of the insights truly, and partially because the sessions can tend to blend together by the end of the day, that your insights are not as fresh and you might not remember as well as you think, and so we do that to make sure that we capture everything really authentically. And the last piece is that we do a debrief day in the field. So instead of allowing everyone to go home to their different offices, or even we're all based in the same office, we keep everyone for one last day. We do a session in the hotel and just discuss all of the insights and try to get a real clear picture of what we've learned. Okay, so that's how we work. I'm going to share 1 or 2 quick stories from these sessions, and then we'll kind of move on to the principles that we've gathered. Okay, so this is a story about one of our participants. We'll call her Rupa. So Rupa, she works at a university, and she has school-age children, 2 school-age children. And she has a smartphone as well that she had bought about 6 months before the research, and she didn't have a data plan for the smartphone. And her main use case for this phone was that she wanted to find study materials for her school-age children. And in particular, she felt it was important to help them with their English classes. But she doesn't speak English fluently, so finding the right materials for study can be hard for her. But she has a solution. A colleague at work will download those study materials for her, and then the colleague will transfer those materials to her phone using an NFC-based file sharing app. And that's how Rupa uses the internet. So the constraints that exist for her might be different than the ones that we often encounter, but she still finds a path to address her needs. An important caveat is, I think, now in India we're seeing less and less that people don't have data plans. That's been a really interesting development. If anyone's working in this space, come talk to me more. There was a really dramatic change in the internet market, I guess about a year to 2 years ago now. And it's dramatically changed everything. And it's something that for us, seeing that kind of dramatic and rapid change has only sort of spurred us on to do this kind of qualitative research and to really understand how things shift over time, because they do. Okay, so one more video for you. This is a person from Pakistan, and this isn't from our own research. I found this and I thought it was wonderful. He's literate, and he's been a feature phone owner, and he has heard of the internet and heard of Google before, but he's never used it. And he's trying to find photos of his favorite actress. Excruciating, isn't it? Sometimes I bring this to meetings. I'm very popular. Okay, so I'm not going to make you sit through the whole video because it is long. And I'm very sorry to say that he's never successful in finding his favorite actress. But I think this is a great example of how our assumptions, so we have assumptions about how something like this looks, how it should work. We have the idea that there's a box, and if you tap inside the box, it's going to trigger the keyboard. And he doesn't have those same assumptions. And it's interesting because you can see how those assumptions then find their way into the product and might make it not that useful for someone who doesn't have them. Okay, that's enough. We're done. All right. Okay, so what are the principles that we've come upon when we're designing for these kinds of users? We think about cost, connectivity, and complexity. So cost, data, and storage are often an issue. Both are disproportionately expensive in many countries. Connectivity can be intermittent and unreliable, and complexity is really the interesting one. It covers a lot of challenges around language, digital literacy, and ramping into new products, and all these kinds of things. So we'll talk about those each briefly. Okay, so the first thing, to beat higher costs, we need to build fast and we need to build light. Since data is more expensive, we have to keep in mind that every step costs time and money. And in particular, lower spec devices have limited storage, so it's really important, more than ever, to design performative products. Okay, this is distressing. Mobile sites take 19 seconds on average to load over 3G, but half of users will abandon sites that take longer than 3 seconds to load. It's not looking good for many of us. We need to do better. And I think speed perception is something that I like to highlight to designers and developers because beyond building performative products, building products that help users perceive the speed differently can also be really critical. So progress bars like this one with backwards animations and decelerating speeds can be seen as much faster than sort of the standard linear progress bar. And the other piece is that I think we all know this if we've ever been waiting in line. Uncertainty and unexplained waits feel longer. So try to give more concrete feedback. Use a determinate indicator like a progress bar instead of an indeterminate indicator like a spinner. And people will perceive the wait as quicker. Okay, so here's a quick DIY. If you have a website, there's one thing you can do to understand how these users might experience it. This is Chrome, obviously. Start by taking a look at your site's loading behavior in the DevTools Network tab. That's there, little red box. And at the bottom, you can read the loading time. That's the little red box at the bottom. This one was 1.02 seconds. Hooray. But there's a little arrow up there. If you open that drop down and you choose the regular 2G preset and hit refresh, oh no, then you'll find that things might be quite different. So this site took over 7, almost 8 seconds to load on a 2G connection. And this is a good 2G connection. Many of them aren't. Okay, so since I'm not a developer, I won't speak in depth today about how to build performative products, but I think it's great, especially for designers, to have an awareness of this, because it has a relationship with what we design and how we design it, and understanding that more clearly can help us improve. So for poor connections, we need to design resilient products. And with a lot of new technologies, we can even design products that are offline friendly. So ultimately, I think we need to think about how to use, we need to think about how to help users bridge the gaps and have a smoother experience when the connection falls out or gets slow. With Google Go, we've done some thinking about how to communicate each of those steps in the connection process. The team created this UI to try to explain what's happening when the connection is slow, to give an idea to users of when something will arrive, and to also kind of show what's going to appear when you get there. We also we show this slow bar at the bottom to try to show which step of the process we're at, and maybe to help people even troubleshoot if they see that the connection is the problem or if the problem might be with the website. So beyond bridging the gaps, I think we need to think deeply about resilience. This is my favorite product ever when it comes to resilience. I didn't bring it. I have one as well. So this is actually a diagram of a flashlight. It's a flashlight designed by Muji, and it works whether you have 1 or the 4 required batteries that it should take. So you can see there, if it has 1, it'll give you sort of a little bit of light. If it has the sort of the bigger one, it'll give you a little more. Basically, it gives you whatever it can with whatever you give it. And I think that's the same principle that we need to use when we're building products for the web. It should never be, well, you don't have a connection, we can't give you anything. But hey, you don't have a connection, well, we've cached this already, why don't you can have a look at that, or we can try to get this for you later, just let us know. And then the other technology that I want to mention is progressive web apps. I wouldn't be a good Google employee if I didn't mention this, but I am genuinely very excited about them. They're basically websites. But they have a set of technologies that let you provide an app-like experience, even if what you're building is for the web. So you get the full screen view, you get an icon on the home screen, you get push notifications, all of these things. But they only take up a fraction of space on the device. And they load quickly, even on very flaky networks. And the best part is they have offline features, so you can cache something like you wouldn't be able to do on a website, but you would be able to do on an app. I think my favorite example of a great progressive web app is Flipkart. So there's a whole story behind this. The summary is that Flipkart, if you don't know, is one of India's biggest e-commerce websites. And a few years back, they decided to abandon their mobile website, and they just put a banner on there telling users to download the app. And what they found was that only about 4% of users did choose to download the app. So they changed their tact. They worked with Google actually to build a progressive web app, which brings together sort of the best parts of their website and their app. And when they released it, they saw a 3-fold increase in time spent on their site and a 70% increase in conversions. Okay, my other favorite example comes from Konga, which is one of the largest e-commerce sites in Africa out of Kenya. And their progressive web app detects that the user is offline and also at the same time has items in their shopping cart. So you're shopping and the connection has dropped out. And then it promotes this offer to go through an offline checkout experience, which is basically to give them a phone call. But it gives them sort of the information about what you've already started to buy and lets that experience be kind of seamless on the way out. Okay, so the last piece that I want to talk about briefly is complexity. And I think this is the most challenging. In the face of complexity, we really need to go back to the basics. We need to design an intuitive UI, a UI that's intuitive for people who might be using the phone for the first time, might be using the phone in a language that's not their first language, or might feel uncomfortable or afraid to break a phone that they've spent a lot of money on, so they don't want to try anything and are afraid to break it. So in our research, we've seen that mobile-first users may not have the same kind of mental models or just experiences as those coming from desktop. So for those users, the complexity of your product can feel amplified. They might be learning new metaphors and modes for interacting with technology. And again, as I mentioned before, they might be navigating in their second language. And I think one of the core challenges that we're seeing is text-based navigation. So I'll speak briefly to this. In India in particular, but in many countries, we're seeing users setting the operating system to English, even though that might not be their primary language. We think this is for a variety of reasons. It might be discomfort with settings or vendors setting up your app for you. It might be that the user's trying to learn English or wants to be perceived as an English speaker. But it means that we need to think about ways to make our apps all navigable, even if people aren't very literate in the language that they're using it. And I think this is a great test, actually. I think when you think about trying to create a product that works well for lower literacy users, well, what does that mean? You have to simplify things. You should use simpler strings and language. You should use iconography to indicate things in multiple ways or images. And really, when you design for lower literacy users, you often create something that's better for everyone to use. Okay, the last piece here. We know that users are less likely to be comfortable with searching. Like query formulation can be difficult. And things like URLs or skimming big bodies of text can be really challenging. So we try to avoid those, the big bodies of text as much as possible. And that's kind of driven the design of Google Go, something that's very tappable, that's very image-based, and that hopefully is easy to use even if you're not comfortable with reading and writing. And for users who are, we try to make switching between multiple languages as easy as possible. And we've seen that multilinguality is rising a lot. So users might be using the app in English, but might want to swap over to Hindi in order to read some content. And we want to make that sort of fluid and flexible. OK, so that's the whole deal. Thinking about cost, connectivity, and complexity, we need to build fast and light, resilient, and even intuitive for our next billion users. Let's bring the web to them. Thanks.
Yeah, we've got a lot of questions. But
I'll be around.
Yeah, we don't have time, so yeah, please, if
Twitter.
that's okay, do grab Rachel because we got a lot of questions.
Oh, good.
So I've gone with the top two because obviously people can upvote. So we'll try and be quick with them. But one that people were very interested in is if you're a company with fewer resources than Google has, how would you suggest people try and understand the demographics that they're targeting?
Okay, so this is really exciting. I could do a whole talk on this. There are a ton of great resources available for this at the moment. First of all, a lot of the big tech companies like Google right now are publishing a lot of their research. We just published a report on gender equity, for example. That's one of the big challenges that I didn't have time to mention. There's an enormous gender gap in a lot of the markets that I mentioned, and a lot of great opportunities. I think Uber's already tackled some of them with some safety features, for example, in their apps. But there's really a broad spectrum of opportunities there. So research-wise, check out what's available, both from the big companies. Obviously, academically, there's a lot coming out as well. And then on top of that, I think it is critical to be able to talk to people as much as possible. So I think for me, what I've seen that I think could work the best is products like usertesting.com and other sort of remote user research products I think are really fascinating. Particularly being in London, it's great because we actually have time overlap with countries like Nigeria and India. So you actually can run remote user testing sessions much better than you can from Silicon Valley, for example. So we often find ourselves being the bridge for a lot of the teams that we work with there. Yeah, I think that's the best option. The other thing that I would mention, if you're really strapped for resources but want to start digging into these markets, start downloading the apps that are popular in these countries. And this will give you an incredible insight into what actually resonates with people. So TikTok has exploded. That's the obvious one to mention. Actually download it and try using it and looking at different videos that you might see. See if you can switch your app settings to Hindi or Marathi, for example, but also see if you can spoof a location and see how your content changes. For me, that's been a really fascinating way to learn about these countries.
Our next question popped up immediately after the video of the search. And they basically were interested in what's the tipping point of how many people you have to watch struggle before you think this isn't making sense to our audience?
Oh, that's a good question. I think it's a question of culture change. And I think that, the ability to kind of bring videos like this and bring sort of artifacts back, that makes such a big difference in this culture change work, because you're only one person and you can only kind of bring your own stories and bring your own anecdotes. But if you bring something that's more tangible, people can see someone struggle. That's really important, because most people who struggle won't always tell you they're struggling. You'll watch them suffer through something. I bet that guy would say, oh yeah, I love Google. It's a sort of very minimal experience. No, that's an exaggeration. But you see people sort of struggle to use a product while simultaneously saying like, oh, it's quite minimal. I think it's quite nice. But to really experience their suffering, I think, has the biggest impact.
Fantastic. Well, to end on the suffering.
Yay!
No, we absolutely love that. But the volume of questions we had, I think, suggests that you were a huge hit. So let's have a massive round of applause for Rachel Ilan Simpson. Thank you so much. It's hugely interesting. Fantastic. Right, I shall let you step down.